Jasmine Crockett, senior legal advisor to the White House, was publicly humiliated and slapped with a $1,000 fine by Judge John Roberts, right in the middle of the courtroom, all because she wore a small cross-shaped earring. But she didn't flinch. She fought back, with razor-sharp legal arguments and with blood still dripping down her cheek. Just days later, Roberts was urgently suspended, and the entire justice system was forced to bow before the truth. So what really happened inside courtroom 6B that sent shockwaves across America? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Jasmine Crockett walked into courtroom 6B with quiet confidence. She wasn't there to argue or testify, just to observe. The president had asked her to personally monitor a sensitive case involving religious freedom, and she took the assignment seriously. Dressed in a tailored gray blazer and white blouse, she looked every bit the professional. But one detail stood out: a small silver cross earring. They were small, almost modest, but they meant everything. A final gift from her late mother, worn in courtrooms from Alabama to D.C., not as a statement, but as a memory, as faith carried in silence. Jasmine took a seat in the middle row, opened her phone to take notes, and kept her head down. But Judge John Roberts noticed her immediately. His eyes narrowed the moment he saw the cross. He didn't glance at anyone else, though others wore loud shirts, flashy necklaces, even political slogans. None of them seemed to bother him. Just her. Just that earring. He didn't say a word, yet. But the tension in the room changed. Jasmine felt it. The shift was subtle, but heavy. Something about her presence, or maybe her quiet defiance, had already drawn a line. And though she didn't know it yet, the cross she wore was about to put the entire courtroom on edge. The moment the gavel struck, silence fell, but it wasn't the kind that brought order. It was tight, uneasy, the kind that warned something was about to go wrong. Judge John Roberts didn't begin the docket. He didn't call a name or look at his clerk. Instead, his gaze drifted straight toward Jasmine Crockett, seated silently in the middle of the courtroom. She wasn't talking. She wasn't doing anything disruptive, just calmly taking notes, her phone resting neatly on her lap. But it wasn't her actions that drew his focus. It was her appearance. More specifically, the small silver cross earring dangling from her right ear. It shimmered faintly under the courtroom lights, subtle but unmistakable. And for Roberts, that was enough. He leaned forward, eyebrows tight, fingers tapping sharply on the bench. "You," he said, his voice slicing through the room like a razor. "Miss, remove that earring. This is a courtroom, not a place to display your religion." His tone was sharp, dismissive, loud enough to turn heads. Jasmine looked up slowly, eyebrows slightly raised but face controlled. Around her, a few people exchanged puzzled glances. No one else had been singled out. Not the man in the defund DC hoodie, not the woman in 3 layers of gold jewelry and a neon pink scarf, not even the teenager in a t-shirt that read "God is dead." Just Jasmine, just the woman with the cross. She stood calmly, posture tall and composed. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice respectful but firm, "I'm here on assignment from the President of the United States to observe these proceedings. I haven't spoken out of turn, and I'm not violating any rule." She gestured briefly to the phone in her hand. "I'm simply doing my job." Roberts didn't flinch. In fact, he leaned in further, voice tightening like a vice. "You may think your position gives you special treatment, Miss Crockett," he snapped, "but in this courtroom, I make the rules." His hand gripped the gavel with visible tension. "You'll remove that cross immediately, or I'll consider it contempt." The gallery stiffened. Someone in the back audibly whispered, "Is he serious?" But Roberts didn't care. His gaze burned with something deeper than judicial authority. It was personal. Jasmine hadn't challenged the law. She had challenged him. And now she realized this wasn't about the Constitution. It was about control. She met his stare without blinking. "With all due respect, Your Honor, faith doesn't end at the courtroom door, and neither does the Constitution." Her voice hadn't trembled. Her posture hadn't shifted. She stood tall in that courtroom with nothing but calm conviction and a silver cross glinting from her ear. But Judge Roberts didn't hear her words. He heard a challenge. His fingers tightened around the edge of the bench. His breath shortened. And then, in a move so far outside judicial protocol it stunned even the clerk, he rose from his seat and stepped down from the bench. The courtroom, once humming with murmurs and the soft clatter of keyboards, fell into a vacuum of silence. His footsteps, slow, measured, heavy. The long, black robe trailed behind him, brushing the ground like a warning bell with every stride. Jasmine didn't move. She stood exactly where she had been, calm, centered, refusing to look away. Her heart pounded, but her eyes didn't waver. Around her, heads turned, shoulders tensed. One man clutched the edge of his seat. A woman in the back instinctively reached for her phone, hands shaking, before remembering the no recording signs posted outside. But this wasn't a normal moment. This wasn't courtroom procedure. This was a raw, public abuse of power, unfolding in real time. Roberts reached her like a charging force cloaked in silence. No hesitation, no warning. He reached up and grabbed the silver cross earring on her right ear, his fingers gripping it like it was a rope he intended to snap. Jasmine flinched, barely, a fraction of a second, but she didn't step back. She didn't give him the fear he wanted, and maybe that's what made him do it. With a sharp jerk of the wrist, he ripped it from her ear. The sound was awful, not loud, but real, a sickening little pop of torn skin and broken trust. Jasmine gasped softly as the pain cut through her face, and a thin line of blood ran down her cheek, catching the light in front of dozens of witnesses. Someone in the back let out a horrified, "Oh my God!" Another voice cried, "He just assaulted her!" But Roberts didn't stop, didn't apologize, didn't even blink. He stood inches from her, looming like a threat given flesh, chest rising and falling with restrained fury. Jasmine didn't touch the blood. She didn't reach for the missing earring. Her hands remained at her sides. But her eyes were fire, cold, focused, unshakable. She stared straight at him, a drop of blood sliding past her jawline, and in that silence, her composure screamed louder than any outburst. And then he leaned closer, too close, and spoke in a voice barely louder than a whisper, but every word laced with venom. "Now, do you understand who holds power here? Not the law, not the Constitution, not the people, just him." In that moment, he wasn't a judge. He was a tyrant in robes. In the courtroom, now breathless and watching, knew they had just witnessed something they'd never forget. Not a legal proceeding, but a betrayal of justice. Jasmine said nothing. Not yet. But something inside her had shifted, not in fear, but in resolve. The gash on her ear burned, sharp and hot, but Jasmine Crockett didn't reach for it. A drop of blood slid past her jaw and landed on the collar of her blazer, staining the white fabric just beneath the seam. She didn't flinch. Her hands remained at her sides, steady. Her breathing was slow, precise. She could feel a dozen eyes on her, some wide with disbelief, others brimming with silent outrage. She could also feel Judge Roberts towering inches away, his chest heaving slightly, the sour sting of adrenaline radiating off him like steam. But Jasmine didn't shrink back. She raised her head, met his eyes, and spoke. Not loud, not emotional, but with a calm so exact it became its own form of violence. "You just used physical force," she said, each word cut from iron. "In a courtroom, a place meant to protect the law, not break it." Her voice didn't rise, but its weight spread through the room like a slow explosion. "Because of this?" She gestured toward her bleeding ear, her tone almost incredulous. "A small silver cross?" Her gaze pierced him. "That wasn't law. That was bias. That was anger. That was control." She stepped back, not in retreat, but in refusal. "This, what you've done, isn't about courtroom decorum. It's abuse of power, and you did it in front of a room full of witnesses." For a split second, the courtroom held its breath again. Judge Roberts's mouth twitched, his jaw clenched tight. You could almost see him struggling to contain something. Rage, panic, or the sudden realization that he had gone too far in front of the wrong woman. He reached for the gavel like it was a weapon. Crack. The sound echoed like thunder, snapping the tension but not the shame. "Enough!" he roared, voice cracking at the edges. "You're out of line." His face was blotchy now, red creeping across his cheeks, his control disintegrating. "You're disrupting this court with your presence, your attitude, and your disrespect for this institution." He didn't pause. He didn't reflect. He just lashed out. "I'm fining you $1,000, he growled, "for contempt of court." Gasps rippled through the gallery. A woman near the back pressed a hand to her mouth. The court clerk stopped typing mid-sentence, her fingers hovering motionless above the keys. Even the bailiff, standing rigid beside the bench, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking from Jasmine to Roberts and back again. They had seen harsh judges before, but this was something else. A personal vendetta disguised as discipline. A man unraveling in real time, using the bench not as a seat of justice, but as a shield for his own bruised ego. The fine landed like a slap, but Jasmine didn't move. She didn't plead. She didn't yield. Instead, she turned, slowly, deliberately, and raised her hand. Not in protest, but in precision. "Your Honor," she said, voice clear and grounded, "you claim to enforce neutrality in this courtroom." Her eyes scanned the gallery, then landed sharply on a young man seated 3 rows ahead, legs stretched, slouched with the kind of casual defiance that usually invited correction. "That gentleman," she continued, pointing calmly, "is wearing a hoodie with a political slogan, 'Resist,' in bold red letters. Yet he's still seated, uninterrupted, unchallenged." She let the moment settle, then shifted her gaze to the opposite side of the courtroom. "And that woman," Jasmine added, gesturing toward a middle-aged woman dressed like she was heading to a cocktail party, "is wearing a necklace the size of a Christmas ornament display. No one has asked her to remove it. No questions, no warnings, no threats of contempt." The gallery followed Jasmine's gaze. Heads turned, eyes flicked back and forth, and an uncomfortable rustling spread like a ripple through still water. "So tell me, Judge," Jasmine said, her voice tightening with restrained intensity, "why is my earring the only thing you find offensive?" For a beat, Roberts said nothing. His mouth was a hard line. His hands clutched around the gavel, flexed slightly with a tremor that betrayed what his robe tried to hide. He wasn't in control anymore. Not of the courtroom, not of the moment, and not of her. The silence was no longer tense. It was damning. Eyes across the room shifted from her to him, then back again. The young man in the hoodie suddenly pulled it down, uneasy. The woman with the necklace shrank in her seat, reaching up instinctively to touch the stones. They knew. Everyone knew. And then, from the last row, a voice broke the silence. Not loud, not angry, just tired and deeply human. An elderly man, slouched in a veteran's jacket worn at the elbows, leaned toward the man beside him and muttered, just loud enough to be heard, "This isn't justice anymore. It's theater. Bad theater." The words rolled through the room like a quiet indictment, and no one laughed. No one scoffed. Because it was true. This wasn't about legal decorum. This was about selective outrage. About a judge who ignored slogans, glitter, and flash, but tore a woman's ear because her faith didn't match his comfort zone. Jasmine didn't speak again. She didn't need to. Her question still hung in the air, unanswered, and now unignorable. The courtroom still pulsed with the aftershock of her question. The blood on her cheek had dried now, but the wound was no longer the most visible injury in the room. It was the silence. A silence that wrapped itself around Judge Roberts like a noose made of facts he couldn't twist. Jasmine stood perfectly still, her breath steady, her voice calm. But what she did next was a direct hit to the very foundation of his authority. She didn't shout. She didn't protest. She did something more dangerous. She cited the law. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady enough to cut glass, "if this courtroom still claims to operate under the Constitution, then I'd like to bring a ruling to your attention." Her words didn't echo, but somehow every syllable landed with terrifying clarity. "Church of Lukumi Babalu I Virge, City of Hialeah, 1993. A hush fell deeper over the gallery. The clerk blinked. A young man near the back actually mouthed the words to himself, unfamiliar but clearly resonating with weight. Jasmine didn't break eye contact with the man who had just fined her, injured her, and tried to silence her with power. In that case, she continued, the United States Supreme Court ruled that no government official, local, state, or federal, has the right to restrict religious expression unless it directly disrupts public order. She paused just long enough for the words to sink in, her hands still at her sides, her spine straight, her tone never rising. I wore a cross earring, she said plainly. I didn't speak out of turn. I didn't shout. I didn't interrupt. You made it an issue. You disrupted the court, not me. A ripple moved through the room, barely audible but real. And if you're punishing me for my faith without disruption, you're violating binding Supreme Court precedent. That's not courtroom order. That's unconstitutional discrimination. Her words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. She hadn't accused. She had proved. Not with opinion, but with precedent. Not with anger, but with law. And for the first time, Roberts wasn't just facing a defiant observer. He was facing a legal mind sharper than his own. His fingers twitched slightly on the gavel. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came out. He blinked. Once. Twice. And Jasmine didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't gloat. She simply let the facts sit in the silence. In that moment, the courtroom no longer belonged to him. The silence was no longer just tension. It was gravity. Thick, suffocating, almost sacred in how completely it held the room. Jasmine stood in the center of it, a figure of poise and precision, the dried blood on her cheek now less shocking than the truth in her words. She had cited Supreme Court precedent without flinching, and not even the judge dared to challenge it. The courtroom wasn't just still, it was watching, truly watching now, as if everyone present had suddenly remembered what justice was supposed to look like. And just when it seemed the moment had reached its peak, Jasmine spoke again, softly, but with a force no gavel could match. My earring, she began, is smaller than the necklaces and bracelets I see around this courtroom. It doesn't shine. It doesn't make noise. It's barely visible unless you're looking for it. Her eyes scanned the gallery, not accusing, but calm and clear. But somehow it's the only thing that made you stop the entire court. The only thing that made you stand up, walk across the room, and physically rip it from my ear. She turned to face Roberts again, her voice steady. That's not because I broke any rule. That's because it made you uncomfortable. And personal discomfort is not how justice works. Her words hit hard, not loud but undeniable. What bothered you wasn't the earring itself, she said. It was what it represents. My faith. My right to believe something you might not agree with. And that's exactly what the law is supposed to protect. The shift in the room was real now. People weren't just watching, they were feeling it. The injustice had gone from abstract to visible, and everyone knew it. Jasmine's next words landed like a final verdict. This isn't about court rules. This is about your bias, and that has no place in a courtroom. Roberts didn't speak. He couldn't. His face flushed deeper, not just with fury, but with something harder to hide, shame. He gripped the edge of the bench like it could anchor him, but the power he thought he had was crumbling in silence, because now the whole room understood. The law wasn't on his side, and Jasmine had made sure no one would forget it. The silence in courtroom 6B had shifted again. What began as shock was now something heavier, a collective reckoning. Jasmine had spoken the law, pointed out the bias, and stood her ground with blood still drying on her cheek. But as Roberts sat frozen, unable to claw back the authority he thought was his by default, Jasmine made her final move. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She reached into the inner pocket of her blazer, calmly, deliberately, and pulled out a checkbook. It was the kind of gesture so unexpected, so out of place in a room still shaking from moral collision, that it pulled every eye back to her. The gallery watched in silence. The court clerk blinked rapidly, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. The bailiff shifted his weight, unsure whether to intervene or simply bear witness. Jasmine opened the checkbook like someone unfolding the next page of a story she had been writing from the moment Roberts called her out. She took her time, not to be dramatic, but to be precise. Every detail mattered now. Her pen moved in short, confident strokes. Date, amount, signature, $1,000. Then came the rip, clean, sharp, final. She stepped forward slowly, not as a defendant, not as someone defeated, but as someone delivering a message written in ink and principle. When she reached the edge of the bench, she placed the check directly in front of Judge Roberts. Not tossed, not slammed, just laid down, quietly, visibly, like evidence. $1,000, she said, voice steady. Paid in full, for the crime of wearing a silver cross. She didn't blink. This is no longer just a fine. This, she gestured to the paper between them, is proof that a judge in a United States courtroom chose to punish a citizen for her faith, not for speaking, not for disrupting, but for existing in silent disagreement with his comfort zone. The room didn't move. Roberts didn't move. His hands curled slowly around the edges of the bench, but he didn't pick up the check. He stared at it like it was radioactive, because it was. It was undeniable, permanent, a receipt of his overreach. Around them, the gallery shifted. Some looked away, embarrassed for him. Others stared at Jasmine with a kind of stunned respect. No gavel strike could erase what had just been recorded in real time, in front of dozens of witnesses. And Jasmine hadn't resisted. She had complied, with brutal clarity. She turned the fine into a weapon and placed it right back into the judge's hands. The courtroom hadn't spoken since she laid the check down, but Jasmine knew the real judgment wasn't happening there. Not anymore. That war was moving elsewhere, to inboxes, feeds, and headlines. With a practiced calm, she opened her encrypted legal portal, eyes still forward, face unreadable. She selected the full courtroom audio, capturing every moment from Roberts' first objection to his voice cracking under pressure. She attached a sharp, close-up image of her torn ear, time-stamped less than 10 minutes after the incident. And finally, she scanned and uploaded the fine, $1,000, signed under threat of contempt, for a cross no bigger than a thumbnail. No commentary, no flourish. Just cold, organized truth. She entered the recipient, White House Legal Affairs Division. Subject line, physical contact and religious targeting by federal judge, courtroom 6B. Then she hit send. A few seconds later, she opened X. She didn't follow trends. She created them. Her fingers hovered only for a breath before she typed, ripped out my earring. For my faith. But I've got the evidence. Shepherd, Crossing Court. She hit post. The impact was immediate. At 2:48 p.m., the tweet was live. By 2:51, it had crossed 20,000 views. By 2:56, reporters were texting courthouse clerks for statements. By 3:05, the hashtag #CrossInCourt had erupted across the legal and political landscape like a legal earthquake no one had seen coming. Civil rights attorneys began reposting it with commentary like, if this is true, Roberts is finished. Faith-based legal defense groups chimed in, citing constitutional violations. Legal scholars at Georgetown and Yale reposted the audio she'd embedded through an encrypted link, verifying that the judge had raised his voice, issued a contempt fine for a passive religious symbol, and physically confronted a government official. Jasmine didn't say a word more. She didn't need to. The evidence was speaking now. Major law outlets joined in, Liberty Journal, Constitutional Watch, National Bar Media, each picking up the tweet and dissecting it like it was a leaked ruling. By 3:30 p.m., mainstream headlines began appearing. Federal judge accused of assaulting woman for religious jewelry. Legal firestorm erupts in D.C. after Crossing Court post. White House legal team receives formal complaint after courtroom incident. And then the questions started flooding in, not to Jasmine, but to the judge. Press emails hit the court's public affairs inbox. Cameras began circling the courthouse lawn. Radio anchors debated live whether Roberts should be suspended pending investigation. Former DOJ attorneys began weighing in. The American Center for Law and Justice issued a rare real-time statement. If this occurred as described, it is a serious breach of constitutional protections under the First Amendment and equal protection. We are monitoring this case closely. By the time Jasmine left the courthouse steps at 3:42 p.m., her name had reached cable news scrolls and was appearing in alerts on legal news feeds nationwide. But she didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply walked to the curb, phone in hand, and opened a new message, this time addressed to her senior legal advisor in the West Wing. Incident documented, national reaction building. We need to be ready by 6. She hit send, and without ever raising her voice, she had just shaken the foundation of judicial power. As the digital storm outside grew louder, hashtag by hashtag, headline by headline, the walls inside the courthouse began to shift in a quieter, deadlier way. Jasmine's evidence had drawn blood. But what came next wasn't a tweet. It wasn't viral. It was something far more dangerous to a man like Judge Roberts, a sworn testimony from inside his own ranks. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson had been the court clerk in room 6B for 12 years. She'd typed every ruling, scheduled every docket, and handed Roberts his morning coffee more times than she could count. She was discreet, respected, and, until that day, loyal. But what she'd witnessed that afternoon broke something in her. Not just the violence, not just the injustice, the familiarity. She'd seen that face before. That switch in his eyes when he spotted a cross or a headscarf. She'd been writing it down for years, telling herself she was keeping records for consistency. The truth? She had been collecting evidence. That evening, after the courthouse emptied and the noise faded to distant sirens and news vans humming outside, Thompson walked into a secured administrative office on the second floor. She held a worn leather notebook in her left hand, her name badge clipped tight to her cardigan. Her heart pounded, not with fear but with something colder, clarity. She sat down, opened a new misconduct complaint form, and began to write. Under the section pattern of behavior, she detailed 23 specific cases over the last 5 years where Judge Roberts had reprimanded or fined people for wearing religious symbols. Small crosses, crucifixes, rosary bracelets, hijabs, crescent pendants. In several cases, he had labeled the symbols disruptive, even when they caused no interruption. Yet in that same time frame, she noted, not once had he reprimanded individuals for secular clothing violations, shirts with profanity, aggressive political slogans, oversized jewelry, or even gang insignias. And she didn't stop there. She scanned the notebook, neatly handwritten pages, margins full of her own shorthand notations. She attached photos where she had discreetly recorded unusual rulings. She included dates, witness names, courtroom docket numbers. Then she wrote her formal statement, slow and deliberate, as if each word weighed more than the last. For over a decade, I've watched Judge Roberts enforce courtroom decorum selectively. When someone walks in with flashy jewelry or inappropriate slogans, he looks the other way. But when it's a cross or a hijab, something changes in him. He gets tense, short-tempered, aggressive. I've seen him issue contempt threats over a rosary. I've seen him make a teenage girl cry for refusing to remove her headscarf. I thought it was coincidence. Then it became pattern. After today, I know it's bias, and I can't stay quiet anymore. She signed it with a trembling hand, but her voice on paper was clear as fire. By 7:12 p.m., her complaint had reached the Office of Judicial Conduct, marked as high priority. A special internal affairs folder was created. R.E. Roberts, John, alleged pattern of religious discrimination. It was flagged for immediate review. That same hour, the chief administrative judge of the district received a sealed packet with the headline summary. New allegations suggest years-long pattern of biased enforcement against religious individuals in courtroom 6B. And behind that report stood not an outsider, not a political enemy, but the one person Roberts trusted to guard the rhythm of his courtroom for 12 years. Now she was the first official voice to break ranks, and the one person who knew exactly where all the skeletons were buried. The dominoes were starting to fall, and this time no gavel would stop them. If Mrs. Thompson's testimony cracked the foundation of Roberts's legacy, James Wilson's statement drove the first nail into its coffin. As the court clerk's report circulated quietly through the Office of Judicial Ethics, a second file landed in their inbox less than an hour later. This one marked confidential declaration, judicial misconduct, security staff statement. The name at the bottom sent a jolt through the administrative chain. Officer James Wilson, Senior Court Security Officer, D.C. District, badge number 714. Wilson had worn that badge for nearly 2 decades. He was the kind of man who knew the creaks of every courtroom bench, the timing of every coffee delivery, the posture of every judge before a decision dropped. He wasn't a lawyer. He didn't quote Supreme Court cases. But his eyes had seen more inside courtrooms than most people would in a lifetime. And what they had seen under Judge John Roberts could no longer stay buried. That evening, he sat in the back room of the courthouse security office, alone, with the hum of a vending machine in the background and a legal pad under his hand. He wrote slowly, clearly, each line more painful than the last, because it wasn't just about what he saw. It was about what he didn't say at the time. Over the past 15 years working in courtroom 6B, I've watched Judge Roberts react to religious expression in ways I've never seen from any other judge. When someone walks in with a cross necklace, a crucifix earring, or a visible hijab, his whole demeanor changes, his tone sharpens, his mood darkens. I've seen him pause a session just to glare at someone, silently praying. He continued, listing dates and case numbers where individuals were admonished, fined, or threatened explicitly due to visible religious symbols. Never for conduct, never for disruption, but simply for presence. His records included a young man fined for wearing a St. Benedict medal, a Muslim woman told her headscarf was too political, and a father once removed from the gallery for wearing a shirt that said faith over fear. Meanwhile, then Wilson wrote, I've watched people walk in wearing profanity on their shirts. I've seen defendants with gang tattoos fully exposed, jurors with political buttons, and witnesses with glittering jewelry that distracts the whole gallery. Not once did Roberts say a word to them. His final paragraph struck with the power of unfiltered conscience. When Jasmine Crockett was assaulted today, I stood 10 feet away. I saw it all. She did not raise her voice. She did not resist. She followed every rule. And he still punished her for the cross on her ear. I've enforced courtroom order my whole career. But what I saw today wasn't order. It was personal retaliation dressed up as law. And I can't be quiet anymore. He signed his name slowly, pressing hard into the paper. Then he scanned it, encrypted the file, and sent it directly to the Inspector General's inbox. That same night, the Office of Judicial Oversight opened a formal inquiry file titled Systemic Targeting of Religious Symbols. Judge John Roberts. 2 first-hand accounts. 2 internal witnesses, neither with anything to gain, both with everything to lose, and both of them finally telling the truth. The walls were closing in faster than anyone had predicted. With Thompson's notebook published internally and Officer Wilson's testimony, now part of an official ethics investigation, the storm outside the courthouse had turned into a Category 5 political and judicial crisis. The hashtag number sign crossing court was no longer just trending. It had breached national primetime news. Commentators, legal scholars, and faith leaders were calling for immediate accountability. And within the marble corridors of the D.C. Judicial Oversight Council, the pressure had become unbearable. By 9 a.m. the following morning, the council held an emergency closed-door meeting, each member armed with a dossier filled with witness statements, screenshots, and judicial history charts. A red folder marked Roberts' Immediate Review sat at the center of the table. Jasmine's tweet had opened the door. The clerk and bailiff's testimonies had shattered the lock. Now, with more than 24 verified complaints under scrutiny and mounting public outrage, the council's hands were tied. At 10:32 a.m., a statement was quietly uploaded to the council's official site, just 42 words long, but its impact would ripple across the country. Effective immediately, Judge John Roberts is suspended from all judicial duties, pending formal investigation into allegations of discriminatory enforcement and misconduct. The council will review the matter under accelerated procedure. No press conference, no spin. Just a clean surgical incision into the career of a man once thought untouchable. Minutes later, the news broke wide. Every major network interrupted programming. Anchor desks read the bulletin with visible disbelief. On X, the hashtag number sign Roberts suspended surged into the global top 5. And inside courtroom 6B, where a new judge was hastily assigned to the morning calendar, Roberts' nameplate had already been removed. The bench was empty, and the man who had ripped an earring from a woman's ear in the name of order was now stripped of the authority he once wielded like a weapon. The suspension of Judge Roberts wasn't just a headline, it was a signal, a pressure valve finally releasing after years of whispered stories and redacted reports. The legal system in D.C. had weathered controversy before, but nothing like this. This time, the system itself was under the microscope. And it wasn't because of a leaked document or a political scandal or even a courtroom outburst. It was because of a single earring, ripped from the ear of a woman sent by the White House to observe justice. By noon the next day, the D.C. Judicial Oversight Commission convened a special emergency assembly. What had begun as a personnel matter was now a systemic crisis. With public pressure mounting and media scrutiny intensifying by the hour, the commission issued a sweeping declaration. Effective immediately, the commission is launching a full investigation into religious bias and uneven application of courtroom decorum policies across all D.C. district-level courtrooms. All contempt rulings, fines, and disciplinary actions tied to dress code violations over the past 6 years will be reviewed. Special attention will be given to incidents involving visible religious expression. This was unprecedented. For the first time in its history, the commission empowered a special task force made up of civil liberties lawyers, retired federal judges, First Amendment scholars, and representatives from multiple faith-based legal advocacy groups. They were given access to sealed records, security footage archives, clerk notes, and internal memos from dozens of courtrooms. What started in Room 6B was now a citywide investigation, the largest probe into judicial discrimination ever launched in the district, and the world noticed. At 2:10 p.m., Washington Post ran the headline, "One earring, one courtroom, one reckoning. D.C. legal system under fire." By 3:15 p.m., CNN opened with, "A judge suspended, a court system exposed." On conservative talk radio, the line repeated like a drumbeat, "She wore a cross. He tore it off." Now the courts answer to us. Social media exploded again. Hashtags collided. Dr. Cross in court was now joined by Judicial Bias DC, Josh Faith is not a crime, and Thompson was right. Civil liberties organizations shared infographics comparing contempt fines for profanity versus religious symbols. Legal YouTubers did breakdowns of Jasmine's constitutional arguments, and more than a dozen people, defendants, spectators, even a former court reporter, came forward with their own stories from Roberts' courtroom. "He scolded me for wearing a rosary bracelet," one woman tweeted. "Said my hijab was distracting during jury selection," posted another. "He let a man walk in with a beer logo on his hoodie, but fined me $250 for a gold crucifix." Each story added fuel, but one image returned again and again. Jasmine Crockett's silver earring, small, elegant, stained with blood, now reprinted in national op-eds and legal journals as the symbol of a much larger reckoning. Behind the scenes, federal watchdog groups began quietly contacting the D.C. Commission, asking if this pattern extended beyond the city. State court systems in Virginia and Maryland started preliminary internal reviews of their own decorum violations. Faith-based attorneys nationwide called on the U.S. Judicial Conference to consider updating training on religious expression in the courtroom. And amidst it all, one quote spread across social media from a New York Times editorial posted late that evening. "In America, a judge is meant to wear the robe of law, not the mask of personal bias." What happened in courtroom 6B wasn't just misconduct, it was a mirror. And now the entire justice system must look into it. The investigation had begun. The spotlight wasn't leaving. And the silence that once protected injustice, it was shattered. The investigation was no longer just a headline. It had become a fire alarm ringing through the halls of every courthouse in the District of Columbia. What started in room 6B with a ripped earring and a bleeding ear now echoed inside the chambers of the D.C. Judicial Council, where high-ranking officials gathered for an emergency policy summit. The evidence was irrefutable, the outcry undeniable. The reputation of the entire court system hung by a thread, and that thread was unraveling in full view of the American public. It wasn't just about Judge Roberts anymore. It was about the rules that allowed men like him to operate unchecked for years. And finally, that was about to change. Inside a packed hearing room, draped in the seal of the district judiciary, Chief Justice Eleanor Keene stood before a row of anxious press and court employees. She adjusted her glasses, cleared her throat, and began reading from a printed statement, her voice steady, but with an undercurrent of reckoning. Effective immediately, the D.C. Judiciary hereby enacts a district-wide policy revision regarding religious expression within courtrooms. No individual shall be fined, penalized, or reprimanded for the display of any religious symbol, be it a cross, hijab, Star of David, scripture pin, or other faith-based accessory, unless there is clear, documentable evidence that such display directly disrupts court proceedings. She paused. Cameras clicked. Notepads flew open. The room was silent but charged, as if waiting for something bigger. Furthermore, she continued, every judge, clerk, bailiff, and courtroom officer across all D.C. courts will undergo mandatory First Amendment training with a focus on religious freedom, neutrality, and bias de-escalation protocols. This training will be supervised by constitutional scholars and civil rights attorneys selected by an independent ethics panel. The announcement dropped like a thunderclap. It wasn't just policy, it was a confession that the system had failed, and it would no longer look away. A 5-person review board would monitor implementation, and performance evaluations would now include adherence to the new protections. Any future violations would trigger automatic review, with consequences up to suspension or removal from the bench. Legal circles reacted instantly. The ACLU called it a necessary course correction rooted in constitutional law. The First Liberty Institute issued a statement. This is a win for every American who has ever felt silenced for their beliefs. Law students from Georgetown to Howard flooded social media with support, citing the change as the beginning of courtroom accountability in the modern era. But beyond the legalese, beyond the institutional language, something more powerful was happening. Across D.C., laminated posters began appearing at the entrances of every courtroom. They were simple, bold, and unmistakable. At the top, in all capital letters, religious freedom is not a distraction, it is a right. Beneath it, the First Amendment printed in full. At the bottom, a final line. This courtroom abides by the Constitution, and so will its officers. Clerks stood in line for the new training, some quiet, some shaken. Bailiffs asked questions they'd never dared before. Young judges scribbled notes with a kind of humility their predecessors never showed. And for the first time in years, people of faith entered courthouses not with fear, but with documentation on their side. And somewhere in the heart of D.C., Jasmine Crockett watched the policy change scroll across her screen. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just whispered under her breath, "About time." Because the policy may have been new, but the injustice it addressed had always been there. And now, thanks to one cross, one moment, and one woman who refused to stay silent, the law was finally listening. The ink on the new D.C. courtroom policy was barely dry when the next headline sent a jolt through the national legal community. What Jasmine Crockett had started as a mission of observation had transformed into something no one, including her, had fully anticipated. It was no longer about a courtroom or a judge. It was about power, reform, and who would hold the gavel next. And this time, it was her. Just 5 days after the D.C. Judicial Oversight Council announced mandatory First Amendment training for all court staff, a second, higher appointment dropped like a controlled explosion across political circles. The White House released a single-line memo delivered to every major outlet before sunrise. Effective immediately, Ms. Jasmine Crockett is appointed to the Federal Commission on Judicial Reform and Ethics, where she will serve as Senior Oversight Liaison, with nationwide authority to review and recommend policy on courtroom conduct, constitutional compliance, and judicial bias. The room where she accepted the role was quiet. No parade, no podium, just the president's senior legal counsel sliding a leather folder across the table, eyes steady. "This isn't a promotion, it's a responsibility," the advisor said. "What you exposed in room 6B, it's not isolated. We need someone with teeth, clarity, and memory." Jasmine nodded, signing her name with calm precision. She didn't crave power, but she'd learned how to wield it. Her official mandate included reviewing complaint data across all federal circuits, opening channels for whistleblowers to report faith-based targeting without retaliation, and leading a new 5-member review board to oversee courtroom compliance in real time. For the first time in history, a black woman, one who had been dragged through the fire for wearing a cross, would now have oversight over judges who once thought their robes made them untouchable. The announcement shook the legal establishment. Some praised her as a symbol of justice sharpened by fire. Others called it political theater. But none could deny her qualifications, or the paper trail of evidence that had pushed a federal judge into suspension and triggered new courtroom policy in less than a week. Within 48 hours of the appointment, 2 of the largest and most politically powerful states in America followed suit. Texas was first. Governor Davis, under pressure from both evangelical voters and civil rights groups, held a press briefing flanked by state judicial leaders. Behind him was a banner that read, "Faith is not contempt." The governor spoke bluntly, "We've seen what happened in D.C., and we're not waiting for the same fire to come here. Texas will establish its own state judicial ethics task force, modeled directly after the one Crockett now leads federally. Every courtroom in this state will be reviewed. No one gets to hide behind the bench anymore." Florida followed hours later. Governor Martinez, normally resistant to federal mimicry, surprised everyone when he held up a copy of Jasmine's viral tweet, "Ripped out my earring for my faith," and read it aloud to a room full of reporters. If we had seen this happen in one of our courtrooms, we would have been ashamed. So we're getting ahead of it. Florida is adopting the new federal courtroom decorum standards, and we're inviting Jasmine Crockett to address our Judicial Leadership Summit next month. She hadn't even unpacked her new office, and already 2 major states were rewriting their judicial playbooks based on her case. But Jasmine remained grounded. She didn't let the headlines inflate her. She remembered the sting of her ear, the hum of the courtroom, the way the air died when the judge stood over her. She didn't seek revenge. What she wanted, what she now had, was a position to protect the next person like her. Someone sitting quietly in a courtroom, wearing a symbol of faith, unaware they were moments away from becoming the target of unchecked power. Inside her temporary office on the top floor of a federal annex building, Jasmine pinned a copy of the courtroom transcript to the wall. Below it, she taped her $1,000 fine receipt, now voided but framed. Beside it, a high-resolution photo of her torn ear. And beneath all of that, a printout of the policy she helped rewrite. This wasn't a trophy wall, it was a war map. Each piece marked a battle fought and won, and a reminder, this wasn't over. Back at the courthouse in D.C., word of her federal appointment traveled fast. Clerks whispered it between case files. Bailiffs nodded quietly when they heard her name. And those who once rolled their eyes at her presence now scanned their conduct a little more carefully. And in courtrooms across Texas, judges began asking new questions. Do we have religious dress code guidelines in writing? What's our audit trail on contempt citations? Can someone forward me that federal memo? The ripple was real, and it was growing. Journalists ran editorials calling her the accidental architect of judicial reform. Law school professors added her case to their syllabi. Religious freedom organizations launched outreach campaigns built around the phrase she had made famous. Faith is not disruption. Faith is not contempt. At a press conference later that week, a reporter asked her, "Jasmine, do you feel vindicated?" She smiled, but only briefly. "No, I feel obligated," she said. "Vindication is for the past. This role is about the future." And as the cameras snapped, her voice lowered, but her eyes stayed sharp. "We're not here to punish judges. We're here to remind them that justice wears no blindfold if it can't see through its own bias." That quote became the new banner across the homepage of the Federal Judicial Ethics Commission website. Because in the aftermath of outrage and blood, of silence broken and robes stripped of immunity, one truth remained unshakable. Jasmine Crockett didn't rise to power. She was dragged into it. And now that she stood there, she wasn't leaving. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the Capitol dome, casting streaks of amber in deep rows across the skyline. Inside the White House, in a modest office far from the cameras and headlines, Jasmine Crockett stood alone. The office wasn't grand. No gold trim, no portraits of past presidents, just neutral walls, a leather armchair, and a large window overlooking Pennsylvania Avenue. But what it held now, on one side of that clean wall, was history. She lifted a small frame with both hands. Inside it, a single document. The $1,000 fine receipt, the very one Judge John Roberts had imposed on her, hand trembling with rage, in front of a room that dared not speak. The paper still bore a faint smudge from the bailiff's fingerprint and a dark ink streak across the judge's signature. She hadn't wiped it clean, because nothing about that day was clean. Jasmine ran her thumb along the edge of the frame, steadying it against the wall. She didn't need a level. Her eye knew balance. She had found it the moment she refused to back down. She pressed the hook into the drywall and hung the frame at eye level, not for decoration, not for pride, but as a silent warning, a message, a line. Here is where the system blinked, and I didn't. She stepped back, her arms folded across her chest. Her blazer was the same deep navy she'd worn the day of the hearing. This time she wore no jewelry, no cross, no earrings, only resolve. Then the encrypted line on her desk buzzed. She picked it up without flinching. The voice on the other end needed no introduction. "Jasmine," said the president, his tone low, almost reverent. "You didn't just observe the courts. You didn't just file a report. You held up a mirror to a part of the justice system that stopped recognizing its own face." She listened quietly. "They tried to humiliate you, to reduce you to an ornament, but instead they crowned you the conscience of a courtroom, and maybe the whole damn country." Her reply came softly but firmly. "All I did was stand still while someone tried to take what wasn't theirs to touch." There was silence on the line. Then with surprising emotion, the president added, "You didn't just wear a cross. You carried it all the way through." They talked for another few minutes. Briefings, next steps, legal language Jasmine had grown fluent in out of necessity. She had become more than a lawyer, more than a reformer. She was a living reminder of what happens when one person says, "No, this stops here." After the call ended, Jasmine didn't sit. She turned to the window, hands clasped behind her back, and gazed out at the city that had tried to swallow her whole. Her eyes tracked the motion on the street, lawyers with briefcases, aides racing across intersections, a tourist snapping photos of the fence. Everything looked normal, but she knew better. Nothing would be normal again. Slowly, she raised her right hand and touched her earlobe. The skin had healed, but the memory hadn't. The sound of the earring tearing away, the hot sting. The moment time seemed to freeze. That silver cross, small, personal, sacred, had been stolen off her body like contraband, but it hadn't been silenced. If anything, it had grown louder. It had whispered into newsrooms, boardrooms, courtrooms. And now it whispered back to her, "You're still here." Behind her, the fine glinted faintly in the soft evening light. It wasn't a badge. It wasn't a trophy. It was evidence. Evidence that she had stood in the fire and refused to move. That she had used the very punishment meant to shame her as the first brick in a new foundation. There was a knock at the door. Her aide stepped in, breathless. "Governor Martinez from Florida just confirmed. Your reform model is being adopted statewide. They've named it after you." Jasmine turned, blinking slowly. "What's the title?" Her aide grinned. "Crockett Protocol. It starts with mandatory training in 117 courtrooms next week." She nodded once. "Tell them to send me their curriculum. I want to review it myself." The aide disappeared as quietly as he had entered. Jasmine walked back to her desk, picked up a pen, and underlined a single line in the reform proposal she'd been editing. "Faith is not disruption. Bias is." She looked up again, letting her eyes drift back to the receipt. They'd tried to make her pay to be quiet. Instead, they'd made her louder. She turned to the window again, watching the city in dusk. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt ready, ready for the next courtroom, the next whisper, the next person who might walk in wearing a cross, a hijab, a yarmulke, anything that made them different, anything that made them vulnerable. She whispered aloud, "You're not alone anymore." And just then, the first stars began to flicker across the sky. Behind her, the fine still hung. Below it, she'd taped a photo. The courtroom frozen in time. The judge standing, her eyes defiant, blood on her collar. A moment of pain transformed into a landmark, a before and after. And as the lights came on across the city, Jasmine Crockett stood in the window of the White House. Not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a sentinel, watching, waiting, and ready. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. The hush that settled over the nation after Jasmine Crockett's ordeal did not mean that the fight was over. In fact, it signaled the start of something far greater. Men and women from countless backgrounds suddenly found a single story, the story of a ripped earring and a contempt fine, speaking to the injustices they too had encountered. Behind the headlines and the legal battles lay an even bigger question. How do we preserve personal freedom in systems designed to protect it, but sometimes fail? This question sparked anxious debates in law schools, in state capitals, and in family living rooms across the country. People began to realize that the true measure of justice is not simply the text of statutes or the echo of a gavel, but how real people are treated when they stand face to face with authority. It wasn't just about punishing a judge or changing a local policy. It was about ensuring that every person of every faith or belief found real shelter under the Constitution's promise. Through Jasmine's quiet defiance, thousands of citizens recognized that even small symbols, a cross earring, a simple prayer shawl, could become flashpoints of contention when prejudice was allowed to flourish unchecked. The fear and pain she endured touched a nerve, reminding Americans that freedom is never automatic. It is secured each time someone defends it. This galvanizing moment showed that law is not an abstract concept, but a living, breathing commitment shared by everyone who dares to speak up. And in facing that shared commitment, an entire system was forced to look inward, confront its biases, and begin the long, uneven path toward redemption. Central to the story's power was the sheer humanity pulsing through each twist and turn. Jasmine's calm courage under the hateful stare of Judge Roberts embodied something ancient in the human spirit, the refusal to surrender dignity, even when cornered. That ancient spark resonated because it wasn't about political sides or media soundbites. It was about a singular person's faith shining in the face of intimidation. Her ability to stand tall, even while her ear bled, connected with people far beyond religious lines. Atheists, agnostics, and believers of every creed saw themselves in her defiance. They understood that an assault on one person's expression was an assault on the possibility of expression for everyone else. Not only had the judge tried to suppress her faith, he had tried to brandish his own authority above the Constitution itself. Yet by condemning her so violently, he inadvertently revealed a deeper national wound. The quiet infiltration of bias into places meant to be fair. Citizens across the spectrum woke up to the realization that if one judge could do this, others might be doing it too, unseen, unchallenged, behind the marble facade of respectability. Jasmine's pain, then, was not just her own. It was a focal point that gave countless unheard stories the momentum to surface. And in that reflection, people found not just anger, but a deeper resolve to ensure that law would never again be wielded like a weapon against the very freedoms it was written to protect. The moral lesson distilled from this upheaval reached far beyond the courtroom walls of District Courtroom 6B. It spoke to everyday scenarios: a teacher forbidding a student's religious necklace, an employer criticizing an employee for wearing a headscarf, or even the subtle glances and murmured insults in a grocery line. Jasmine's story reminded the public that prejudice can slip through the cracks of routine, masquerading as decorum or neutrality. By refusing to remove her earring, she disrupted that masquerade. She laid bare the truth that tolerance isn't passive, it requires active safeguarding. The injustice she faced was not a singular event. It was a testament to the ordinary ways bias manifests, quietly eroding trust in institutions until one person dares to say, "Enough." In that "enough," the public saw the blueprint for civil courage, a single gesture that, when backed by principle, can ripple into significant change. Indeed, the emergence of new policies and the toppling of a once untouchable judge showed how quickly a system can pivot when citizens collectively demand accountability. Ultimately, her earring became a catalyst for that demand, a miniature cross that turned into a towering symbol of resilience. At the heart of this narrative lies a tension between private belief and public power. The story of Jasmine underscores that no position, whether judicial, governmental, or otherwise, can legitimately stand above the Constitution's foundational promises. History has shown how easily power can corrupt or be misused, especially when cloaked in a black robe of authority. Yet when confronted by a single unwavering individual, even the firmest pillars of prejudice can crack. The moral lesson is that faith, in whatever form, deserves neither condemnation nor forced concealment in a nation built on liberty. And faith in this sense extends beyond religion. It is faith in one's inherent right to exist without persecution, to wear symbols of personal significance without fear of reprisal, and to speak or remain silent without injustice. When a system fails to uphold these rights for some, it threatens the rights of all. The unstoppable wave of reforms triggered by Jasmine's stand showed that complacency can be as dangerous as outright malice. Only by confronting bigotry head-on, whether in a quiet hearing or a national forum, can society reaffirm what it claims to stand for. In this reaffirmation lies the beating heart of democracy, fragile but unyielding. Moreover, the story drives home the point that true justice is neither static nor self-sustaining. It needs constant vigilance from individuals willing to wield both reason and fortitude. Jasmine's example confirmed that change rarely starts from the top. It often begins with a citizen quietly acting on principle, refusing to be complicit in wrongdoing. Critics might say that a single cross earring is too small to matter, that real problems in the justice system run deeper. But that earring exposed the everyday cracks where prejudice thrives. It forced a conversation about who is allowed to show their faith, who is permitted to be different, and who controls the narrative of what is acceptable. Seeing the district's judiciary pivot so quickly, drafting new policies and forging new guidelines, proved the earring was not small at all. It was a clarion call. And the country listened, from Florida to Texas, from news stations to city halls, from dinner tables to law schools. It demonstrated that justice, like any living system, can wither or flourish depending on who waters its roots. Yet for all the sweeping policy changes, the moral core of the story lies in Jasmine's personal journey through fear, outrage, and ultimately, perseverance. Nothing about her experience was simple. The physical pain of having an earring torn out, the psychological sting of being publicly humiliated, the aftermath of doubt and concern about how the powerful might retaliate. Still, she chose to document each step meticulously, turning the contempt fine into a symbol not of defeat but of resistance. In doing so, she transformed a shameful moment into a blueprint for others. She showed how critical evidence can be: recordings, photographs, eyewitness accounts, statements from inside the system itself. These elements collectively dismantled the smug belief that the system would protect the powerful at all costs. The unstoppable wave of witnesses, clerks, bailiffs, prior defendants, formed because her resolve lit the way. Through her calm tenacity, Jasmine proved that truth, once visible, can topple fortresses built on silence. An essential takeaway is that real progress often requires the bravery to stand alone before others stand with you. In this story, Jasmine found herself isolated in that courtroom, subject to a judge's wrath while onlookers watched in shock. But when she refused to yield, something shifted. The public, once passive, grew hungry for accountability the moment they tasted the raw footage, the photographic proof, series of testimonies. Suddenly, the outpouring of support was unstoppable. Lawyers volunteered pro bono services, religious rights organizations rallied, and everyday citizens spoke out on social media, launching hashtags that soared. By turning her personal pain into a collective rallying cry, Jasmine ignited the unstoppable wave that forced legislative and judicial bodies to admit their failings. These failings had festered in comfortable darkness, but her crucible of suffering brought them into the burning light of scrutiny. The moral lesson is that solidarity often emerges when one person dares to step into the line of fire, but that first step is always the hardest and the most transformative.